In 1970, SeaWorld opened its second location, not in the city of Orlando, that would arrive later, but in, of all places, a small town outside of Cleveland, Ohio. Built opposite the long-standing Geauga Lake amusement park, SeaWorld Ohio was the first attempt by the company to expand eastwards. Home to tropical fish, dolphins, seals, and, of course, the showstopper of the SeaWorld business, the performing killer whale named Shamu. A park remembered fondly by locals for its 30 years of operation, but a place more notable nowadays for being the only SeaWorld park to permanently close and eventually be left abandoned. I want to take a look at the history of SeaWorld Ohio, the challenge of the company's second park, its changing ownership and attempts to save it, its slow march towards abandonment, and the still evolving story of what will happen to SeaWorld's forgotten park. In 1964, the original SeaWorld park would open its doors in San Diego, a marine mammal park, part of a rapidly changing entertainment landscape across Southern California. The park would attempt to position itself as more than just another aquarium, opening with sea lion and dolphin shows where the animals would perform tricks, alongside multiple marine life exhibits across different themed areas. SeaWorld would see a successful first year, but it would be the next year in 1965 that the park would cement its position in California's tourism industry, when it opened a show featuring a captured orca named Shamu. The Shamu performances would be extremely basic, a collection of tricks with a human trainer carrying a loose Dr. Dolittle storyline. Orcas, also known as killer whales, were an incredibly novel sight at marine parks at the time, having only been first captured in 1961. The chance to see a killer whale up close was a very rare one, and Shamu quickly became the icon of the park. With the seemingly runaway success of SeaWorld and of Shamu, expansion of the brand was imminent, and the park's owners would look east for potential sites to build a second SeaWorld location. The hope for the second location was to draw in the largest number of blue-collar families as possible, families who might not be able to travel out to the West Coast, and so would stand to benefit the most from a new park built locally. To maximize this reach, SeaWorld decided that the new park would be built somewhere between Pittsburgh and Detroit, with northern Ohio looking like the most obvious choice. This area of the country was also chosen as, unlike in coastal San Diego, it was thought that many of the potential visitors may have never seen the ocean before, and so a SeaWorld park could bring some of that experience inland. And conveniently for SeaWorld, their expansion would line up perfectly with changes at an existing Ohio park. Near the small town of Aurora, Ohio, Geauga Lake had been operating as a local amusement park since the 1880s. Adding major roller coasters like its famous Big Dipper in the 1920s, the park had spent a large part of the 20th century experiencing relatively quiet operation. But in 1968, Geauga Lake would undergo a change in management, as it was purchased for $5 million by a company named Funtime Inc. Made up of former managers from the nearby Cedar Point Park, Geauga Lake's new owners immediately began looking for ways to boost attendance at the park, and decided to offer a plot of land on the opposite end of the eponymous lake to SeaWorld. The hope was that the visitors to the brand new SeaWorld park would also decide to pay a visit to Geauga Lake, and despite not being under the same ownership, the two could coexist in a cooperative relationship. The offer was accepted, and in 1968, just 4 years after the first park's opening, 25 acres of land by the lake was leased to SeaWorld as work began on their second location. SeaWorld's new park would be about the same size as its original, and would contain a handful of the same attractions: a dolphin show, a standard aquarium, and a Japanese village area, home to a koi pond, and an exhibit on pearl diving. But after its success in San Diego, it was clear that the main focus at the Ohio park would have to be Shamu. Shamu's original tank was tiny, barely bigger than she was, and its only expansion so far had not been to add more space for the orca, but more seating for paying guests. For the new park, a much bigger arena would be built, with giant 4,000-seat bleachers overlooking a pool that would, at last, be larger. The show would also not be able to open with the real Shamu. Of course, she was still needed at SeaWorld San Diego, and so the plan was to use one of several other killer whales that had been captured in the late 60s, who would just use Shamu as a stage name. Other shows would be planned in their own grandstanded areas too, namely a seal and penguin show, similar to the Sea Lion show that existed in San Diego. And on May 29, 1970, at a cost of $5.5 million, the newly named SeaWorld of Ohio opened to the public. Past the entrance area, with typical guest services buildings, a gift shop, and an exotic bird display, the first major attraction guests would encounter would be the Seal Show, a comedic show with a cowboy theme in the smaller of the two arenas. A few years later, this would become a circus show featuring the Great Sealini. Behind the Seal Show, guests could also find a trout fishing pond, an area where guests could fish for rainbow trout, and then have whatever fish they caught packed on ice to take home with them. I couldn't figure out if these were stored for them to pick up at the end of the day, because the idea of guests carrying around iced fish all day is really strange to think about. Deeper into the park would be the Hawaiian Punch Village, a lunch area housed underneath colourful tents, with that typical late 60s tiki theme serving Polynesian food. And behind that, the Japanese Village, with ornate landscaped gardens, a building with traditional shoji doors, the koi pond mentioned earlier, and the pearl diving exhibit, where divers would demonstrate the technique used to collect pearls from clams in the ocean. Next door was also a deer park, where guests could pet deer roaming the small area. In the park's early years, the shore of the lake also housed a small alligator exhibit. All of these exhibits, though, were secondary to the park's flagship attraction, the killer whale and dolphin area, where guests could watch the park's dolphins performing tricks, and of course, get a glimpse at Ohio's Shamu. In 1970, Ohio's Shamu was an orca named Can-Do, who performed the same Dr. Dolittle show that was done in San Diego, but now in her slightly larger, but still cramped tank. In addition to the shows, there were also petting areas guests could visit to see dolphins and seals in between performances. SeaWorld of Ohio was noticeably smaller than the neighbouring Geauga Lake amusement park, and its attractions were limited. But it didn't really matter. Shamu was what guests came to see, and they came out in large numbers. In its inaugural season, 1 million guests visited the park, double what had been predicted. The place did have one limitation though when compared to its counterpart in California, which was that because of the cold weather in the state, it could only be operated seasonally. And in the winter, the animals, including the 1.5-ton Can-Do, would have to be shipped back to San Diego. But despite this, the owners were thrilled by the success of their second park, and so further attractions were planned during the off-season to flesh out the offerings. The main addition for 1971 would be an extension to the park. Further along the coastline of Geauga Lake, a third stadium would be built for a new water skiing show, where human performers would zip back and forth across the lake, performing stunts and going over jumps. At one point in its history, this show also featured a water skiing elephant. The stadium cost $1.5 million and was, at the time, the largest arena for a water stunt show in the world. The show would be produced by entertainer Tommy Bartlett, who was famous for a similar show he'd put on in the Wisconsin Dells since the 1950s. As for Shamu, in the winter before the reopening, Can-Do sadly died in San Diego, and so another one of SeaWorld's orcas, Kilroy, was flown out in her place. While being lifted into his holding tank in Ohio, in front of a crowd of some 1,200 people, the canvas sling that was carrying him came loose, causing Kilroy to dangle in front of the crowd 30 feet in the air before he was eventually successfully lowered into the tank. Kilroy would perform in a new show named Shamu Goes Hollywood, which would also open in San Diego, finally leading SeaWorld to build a new, larger tank in California. SeaWorld of Ohio enjoyed a second season of further success and of further opportunities for the SeaWorld brand, as down in Florida, the Disney company officially opened their enormous project, Walt Disney World, opening the floodgates for theme park entertainment in Central Florida. In 1973, 2 years after the opening of Disney World, the third SeaWorld park, SeaWorld of Florida, opened just up the road from the Vacation Kingdom. The company now had a park on each coast and one in between. In Ohio, the alligator exhibit and a nearby dancing water feature were replaced by the brand new Triquarium, an impressive indoor display of 3 10,000-gallon tanks housing different groups of fish, sharks, and various other tropical and freshwater species, alongside several smaller educational displays. The next year, Shamu Goes Hollywood was replaced by another show called Shamu for Mayor, now with its starring role played by an orca named Kona. In 1976, the entire SeaWorld business was purchased by a company named Harcourt Brace Jovanovich for $46 million. But the acquisition didn't bring any revolutionary changes to the already successful formula, and the park spent the remainder of the decade welcoming more guests from Ohio and beyond, adding new attractions like an acrobatics stadium named the Nautilus Theatre, and gradually expanding its borders further around the Geauga Lake shore. In 1980, the Shamu show was updated and named Showboat 80, now featuring a second whale named Namu. During this season, 3 whales lived at the park, alternating the roles, and throughout the course of the decade, numerous additional attractions would be opened and closed, like a large pirate ship playground for young kids called Cap'n Kids World, and a $3.5 million penguin encounter, where guests could stand on a moving walkway to see around 100 penguins inside of a climate-controlled exhibit, replacing the Deer Park. Most of the 80s consisted of the same story of steady success and continued expansion, as the park grew in size, establishing itself as a go-to destination for Ohio families, but without any major shifts in operation. That was until the end of the decade, when the seas began to shift on the Inland Ocean Park. In 1988, the SeaWorld empire grew once more, with a 4th location, named SeaWorld of Texas, on the outskirts of San Antonio. And the following year, Harcourt Brace Jovanovich would sell the 4 SeaWorld parks, alongside 2 other parks the company owned in Florida, to brewing company Anheuser-Busch, for a massive $1.1 billion. Anheuser-Busch already operated the successful Busch Gardens parks in Williamsburg, Virginia and Tampa Bay, Florida. The Busch ownership would cause a huge change in direction across all 4 locations. None of SeaWorld's parks had really been struggling, but in the eyes of their new owners, they were now falling behind compared to their competition. By the end of the 80s, the theme park industry was a massive multi-billion-dollar amalgamation of different high-budget themed roller coasters, dark rides, simulators, and shows, particularly near the company's 3rd park in Central Florida. The likes of Disney and Universal were storming well ahead of the quiet family marine park, and Busch felt that in order to survive in the approaching 1990s, they too needed to open not another sea life show, but exciting rides with theming, stories, and thrills to draw in the general public. As Busch saw it, the entirety of the SeaWorld business would have to undergo an identity change. Busch's modernization efforts would face an immediate issue when it came to the park in Ohio, which was that it wasn't allowed to build any rides. When the land was originally leased from Geauga Lake, SeaWorld had signed a non-compete agreement with its neighboring park. Geauga Lake park wouldn't build any animal attractions that might conflict with SeaWorld, and in exchange, SeaWorld wouldn't build any rides. Exactly the opposite of what Anheuser-Busch wanted to do. The agreement looked like it could completely kill Anheuser-Busch's hopes to theme parkify the place. For the time being, they would focus the modernization efforts on the other 3 locations, and Ohio would continue getting animal exhibits and updated shows, with a little bit of that theme design, as the company tried to figure out a way around the restrictions. The first real theme parky attraction would open briefly in 1992, a walkthrough attraction named Monster Marsh, where guests would encounter animatronic dinosaurs, the first and only animatronics to feature in the park. In the mid-90s, a shark encounter attraction was added, home to 4 different species of shark that guests could view from another moving walkway. A new dolphin petting area named Dolphin Cove opened, and a second penguin attraction was added named Patagonia Passage, a 70,000-gallon tank with rockwork and landscaping intending to replicate the tip of South America. But by 1996, the park, now often referred to as SeaWorld Cleveland, was noticeably behind its counterparts in San Diego, Orlando, and even the most recent park in San Antonio, which had introduced a river rapids ride in 1993. Ohio was also the only one of the 4 that had to close through the winter. That year as well, the park also suffered difficulties when a serious incident occurred during the water skiing show, as a boat that was supposed to drive close to the grandstand and splash the audience instead lost control and launched right into spectators, injuring 23 people. In 1997, it did build a new theatre to house a film named Pirates 4D, starring Leslie Nielsen and Eric Idle, a comedic pirate movie complete with in-theatre effects, and a show that would later make its way to several other parks around the world. A good addition to the park, but a pretty unimpressive one, considering that in that same year, SeaWorld San Antonio opened a $21 million roller coaster. Finally, in the year 2000, after a decade of impressive expansions elsewhere, SeaWorld Ohio got its own ride. Sort of. That year brought the opening of Mission Bermuda Triangle, a ride that would get around the restrictions because it was a motion simulator. In the ride, guests would board a submarine to view marine life in the Bermuda Triangle, but stumble upon the wreck of a ship which had gone missing, and they'd have to make an escape from a sudden earthquake. Mission Bermuda Triangle was a solid addition to the park, a well-themed attraction inspired by the likes of Star Tours and Body Wars, but it was also one that, by the time it opened, was already outdated, as it had opened 8 years earlier at SeaWorld Orlando, already replaced there with a newer simulator in 1995. With the combination of the seasonal operation and the restrictions on new attractions, it was clear that by the year 2000, SeaWorld Ohio was far less important to its owners than the other parks, and even though it had finally opened its first ride, that year would be its last. On October 29, 2000, SeaWorld Ohio closed for the season, and in the winter, Anheuser-Busch announced that they had agreed to sell the park to amusement park operator Six Flags for $110 million. The next-door Geauga Lake had been operating under the name Six Flags Ohio for a year already, after a series of deals saw that park's then owners, Premier Parks, acquiring Six Flags from Time Warner in 1998. Now, for the first time in their 31 years of shared history, the 2 parks would be combined into one mega park, entirely wrapping around the lake, opening for the 2001 season under the name Six Flags Worlds of Adventure. Six Flags would inherit most, but not all of SeaWorld's existing attractions, and very little would change from 2000 to 2001 in terms of the outward appearances of the buildings. Attractions like Pirates 4D and Mission Bermuda Triangle would transfer over, as would a lot of the smaller animal exhibits, like the Shark Encounter, the original penguin exhibit, and the pearl diving exhibit, which had been around since 1970. The water skiing show would also remain, but to fit in better with several DC Comics attractions brought in from the Six Flags side of the lake, it would be rethemed to feature Batman characters. The 3 killer whales who had lived in Ohio the previous year would be transferred to San Diego and San Antonio, leaving the park without an orca show for a year. The next year though, Six Flags would purchase several other killer whales from different locations, operating a very similar show in the same stadium named Killer Comeback. As part of the reworking of the area, the Geauga Lakeside had also built several new roller coasters under the Six Flags name. A bridge was built connecting the two sides, and at the beginning of the 2001 season, the new mega park boasted a staggering number of attractions. Unfortunately, while things may have looked up for Worlds of Adventure, its over-eager expansion would create more problems than it solved. Six Flags Worlds of Adventure would last only 3 years. A rapid over-expansion, not just there, but across the whole of the Six Flags business, had left the company stretched thin. Attendance was good. Over 2 million visitors in 2001, but just not good enough to keep up with their rising debts. And by 2004, the Geauga Lake SeaWorld combo would be sold once more, this time to the owners of nearby Cedar Point. The new owners would de-theme a lot of the DC Comics and other IP-based attractions, as they didn't retain their copyright in the sale, and they would seek to profit from local nostalgia, returning the park to the original Geauga Lake name. One more thing that Six Flags would take with them when they left the area was the park's animals, relocated to other Six Flags parks just as the killer whales had been when SeaWorld left. And the remaining attractions, the final major remnants from the SeaWorld era, were left empty. As a result, when Geauga Lake reopened that year, most of the SeaWorld part was walled off from guests, still standing but completely empty. And with the animals now gone, the new owners needed to find a different way to make use of the now desolate park. In 2005, much of the SeaWorld site was demolished and transformed into Geauga Lake's new water park, Wildwater Kingdom, made up of the standard colourful water slides with names like Liquid Lightning, Riptide Run, and Thunder Falls. The Nautilus Theatre was demolished and replaced with a kids' splash zone. The water ski stadium would survive, but no shows would be performed there. The entrance buildings were rethemed and repurposed as locker rental areas and new water park related service buildings. The Phase 1 of Wildwater Kingdom only made use of the northern section of the former park, and the entire southern section, where most of the big attractions had been, remained walled off, with the Triquarium, the Seal Stadium, and of course the once famous Shamu Stadium sitting in disuse just beyond the new boundaries. The bridge that had connected both sides of the lake was also relocated to keep guests away from the shuttered area. A Phase 2 expansion was planned for the following summer though, which would add further slides and a wave pool, and during the off-season in early 2006, the Shamu Stadium was finally demolished. Unfortunately, budgetary constraints resulted in the expansion being scaled back, and the only new area that opened that year was the wave pool, sitting approximately where the Seal Stadium had been. The site of the Shamu Stadium was left empty, and the Triquarium remained standing, still closed and still out of reach from guests. The half-measure expansion would be second to a much bigger issue for the location in 2006. Despite these multiple attempts to replan and renew the site throughout the 2000s, attendance had been steadily dwindling since 2001. It had become harder and harder to convince visitors to take the trip out to Geauga Lake when it was now just another amusement park. The end seemed all but certain that year when several of the park's big roller coasters were torn down and relocated to other parks around the country. And on September 16, 2007, after one final year of operation, Geauga Lake closed permanently. However, Wildwater Kingdom, for some reason, stayed open. The park's owners claimed that in its final years, the water park section was actually the most popular area, and so from the 2008 season onwards, it would continue operation as a standalone destination. Over the next few years, Geauga Lake was steadily demolished, its rides sold off, and its land put up for sale, and Wildwater Kingdom operated as a small, local water park. The water ski stadium, not used for any water ski shows for years already, was torn down, replaced with a simple concrete plaza. The show building for SeaWorld Ohio's only ever ride, Mission Bermuda Triangle, actually remained standing outside the park until 2011. And for the entire lifespan of the water park, the old Triquarium building was left just as it had existed during the SeaWorld era, but also beyond the boundaries of Wildwater Kingdom, unused. In the 2010s, Geauga Lake's land struggled to find a buyer, and while most of the buildings had been demolished, some of the rides, including some of the park's coasters, remained, disheveled and decaying, abandoned by the lakeside. That decay had affected Wildwater Kingdom too. While it was still operating, attendance had never improved to the level that its owners wanted. And finally, in 2016, after 11 years of operation as a water park, and 46 years of operation altogether, Wildwater Kingdom announced it would close on September 5th, this time for good. The slides that had been built in the early 2000s were demolished, leaving the park empty of any of its water park era attractions. But a lot of those old SeaWorld buildings, both the ones in use at Wildwater Kingdom and outside the park, were simply left abandoned. The stadiums were long gone, but the wave pool that had replaced them was left behind, now empty. The entrance buildings all remained in place, as did the buildings that housed the Japanese pearl diving attraction 2 decades earlier. In the north of the park, while the Mission Bermuda Triangle show building had been reduced to its foundations already, the Shark Encounter and the building that once housed the Pirates 4D show was still standing. And of course, the Triquarium, which had essentially been left abandoned already, was definitely now rotting away on the shore of the lake, overlooking the equally decaying amusement park opposite. Obviously, with 2 giant abandoned parks sitting in a now relatively secluded part of Ohio, it wouldn't take long for the remains of SeaWorld to attract its first urban explorers. Most urban explorers seemed more interested in the larger remains of Geauga Lake, but videos of the water park side began appearing online around 2018. The entrance and many of the buildings that had been used for the water park were in relatively good condition, as it hadn't been all that long since they had closed. But those buildings that hadn't been carried over from SeaWorld and later Six Flags were now showing their decay. With some of the first looks inside the Triquarium for years, drained tanks revealed rockwork left behind. The shoji panels of the Japanese village were captured too, as was the distant shell of the Shark Encounter. Drone footage of the site was a common upload on YouTube throughout 2019 and 2020, a much easier ask as many would-be explorers opted to sit outside the gates instead. But that year saw the next sign of progress for the land. A plot of land where the overflow parking had been was purchased by a developer, and very quickly after, a development of new houses was built. The plans also showed the potential for new houses to be built in the park itself, but these never came to fruition. However, 3 years later, the city of Aurora announced that it planned to purchase the remaining land where SeaWorld once sat to redevelop it into a public park. And not only that, but the new park would include a refurbishment of some of the old areas that had been left behind. The wave pool from Wildwater Kingdom was to be refilled as a regular swimming pool. The entrance building would become a new visitors center, the Triquarium would become a restaurant, and the building once part of the Japanese village, opened with the park way back in 1970, would become an as-of-yet unannounced new building too. The site was purchased in late 2024, and the Shark Encounter and Pirates Theatre were demolished around this time too. Today, the planned community park has not yet been built, although additional houses have been built on the Geauga Lake side of the property. But much of the area has been cleared in preparation for the construction, which will hopefully soon arrive. Actually, just an additional update here. While I was making this video, brand new drone footage was uploaded to YouTube by a user named Eric Hansen. showing that as of August 2025, many of those original buildings are still untouched. SeaWorld Ohio found its success as a small tourist destination for local visitors, but when the theme park landscape moved on, it simply got left behind. And with its restrictions preventing it from taking any meaningful steps in that direction anyway, it was obvious why the company viewed it as a far less important venture than their other parks. And then with the subsequent string of acquisitions, it was forced into a difficult situation, expanding a park that was already too big for the area it was in. But the story of SeaWorld Ohio is an interesting and often forgotten part of the company's history. Unless you grew up visiting the place, you'd be forgiven for not realizing that SeaWorld ever had the location. SeaWorld's 3 other locations still operate today. They still retain a lot of their original marine park image, particularly the first location in San Diego, and they still hold killer whales. But without the same restrictions as Ohio had, they've also managed to evolve into the modern theme parks Bush always wanted them to be. Did you ever visit SeaWorld Ohio or any of its replacement parks? What are your memories of it? And regardless of whether you went there or not, what do you think of the current state of the site, and what are your hopes for the future? Let me know in the comments. Really pinning down the history of this place has been very, very difficult. There are so many intertwining threads and changing ownership of different parks and stories about the Six Flags expansion and the Ohio theme park industry and the changing directions of SeaWorld. I wanted to tell a story about SeaWorld Ohio specifically, rather than getting sucked into too much of the Geauga Lake side of things, and I hope you've enjoyed hearing me talk about it. There's definitely a few wider stories about SeaWorld as a whole that I think might be interesting, and maybe I'll tackle those sometime in the future. As for now, I haven't asked this question in a long time, but if there's anything else you'd like me to cover in the future, please let me know. Other than that, if you're new here, please consider hitting subscribe, as there are always more videos about theme parks coming in the future, and as always, I'll see you next time.